Thank you very much, and thank you for Tony for the invitation. You've just set it up far more grand than I'm actually going to do, and what I will talk about is some of the difficulties that there's lots of practitioners in the room, so we all know what the difficulties are, especially in a time when there's very little money available, there's very little value placed on a lot of these issues by local authorities, by council members, sometimes developers, sometimes the government centrally, and we've all got different ways of trying to address these problems, but there is no one way. And I think that's one of the messages I want to say today, that there is no one way of doing this, because every place is context specific. Every place relies on the people who are working there and their specific skills or expertise. And we've got to link these people with the locations, with the context they're working in. And these are quite basic ideas. They're not new, they're not innovative, but we sometimes forget them when we're trying to do something quickly. So I'll go through a lot of these things, and I'm going to raise some questions, but hopefully provide a few shorter answers. There will be a point when I put up some maths, and the economists in the room, please don't kill me. It's not scientifically maths, it's pub talk. But academics spend a lot of time in the pub. When I was a practitioner, we didn't spend as much time in the pub. But one of the questions I heard over coffee was somebody was saying that we don't actually know what green infrastructure is. There are many different definitions and use of it, and we had two this morning, which sort of scuppers my first thing that I thought everyone would know what it would be. I do this quite a lot, so I think there are certain fundamental principles that we all could adhere to: multifunctionality, connectivity of landscape resources, integrated management and strategies. And I think if we can understand those, then we can then look at what it does. So we can talk about different systems and how they all work together, what's maybe missing in terms of a landscape network, and then work out what we need to do. And two examples here: a very urban site, a very, well, not a rural site, but a water-based site. And they're both green infrastructure. And I think that's been one of the problems that we may have had talking to government about, is that it is this plethora, this spectrum of sites. It's not just one thing. It's a lot of different approaches to a very thorny issue, the landscape. And so when we try and discuss these things, there's sometimes a lack of consensus or continuity in terms of the things we talk about. And that, as an academic, is great, because we can then write about it, but as a practitioner, very selfish academics, as a practitioner, it's very difficult to have a coherent message to take to members. I remember when I worked in East Cambridgeshire, in the first week I was there, they were saying, okay, how much will this cost? And I was like, oh, well, here's some figures. Went, well, how much will it cost to maintain? It's like, I don't know. It's like, well, you can't take it to committee until you get the figures, because without the figure, no one will take it seriously, and it doesn't fall into a budget sheet. So you've got to be really, really quite specific, which I think a lot of the environment sector has been quite reluctant to do, because the numbers are scary. And if you get them wrong, they're the thing that will always come back up. So I assumed that people would know what the first two things on the slide would be. That was my basic first false assumption. But the second two, I think, are probably maybe then less problematic, that we can deliver lots of different approaches or different things in the right locations. So that's okay, but then it's who pays for it. And there are lots of different models. We've heard about the economics of it this morning, about placing it in the international sphere or a very local sphere. But there's still a big question mark there, and it's one which isn't going away. We've seen major investment in the Olympic Park here, and that was a very complicated project, but it worked. So it can work. It just needs to have the right people and a bit of enthusiasm there. But there are a few fundamental ideas I think we need to talk about. It's like, what are we trying to do and why? What are we trying to invest in? Is it investing in healthy parks and healthy cities? Is it in ecosystem services? Is it biodiversity enhancement, better connectivity, better cycling infrastructure? The comment this morning about cycling in London being difficult, in Liverpool it's deadly. I love cycling in London because everyone knows what they're doing. In Liverpool, people will try and kill you on a daily basis. So personally, I think it works here, but we need to know how to do this. And so depending on what we're trying to invest in, we then have to have the reasons why. We can't just invest in biodiversity for the sake of it, because that doesn't sit well with politicians. There has to be a reason. And because of this, we can get a very convoluted process of investment and discussion that those people who are involved in the process may not be the best people to be involved. They might be the people who hold the purse strings, but don't understand the information or the data or the way things work together. And so we have to try and educate them and take them along a journey, but they don't always want to listen, because invariably there's the bottom line figure, which we have to work towards. So getting the right people involved is really important. If we have policy in place to support that, be it from the old regional spatial strategies, which I actually found were quite good for green infrastructure, to where we are now with the National Planning Policy Framework, which is more vague but open to interpretation, we can ask bigger questions about why are things missing? Why are specific things which we've campaigned for or have data for, evidence for, why are they missing from these discussions? And one of the things is the money issue, nearly always absent from these discussions. So we have to talk about the scale, the process, and the actual implementation of investment which we're looking towards. And this is, again, it's one of those things that the environment sector is doing quite quietly. It's saying, please let us build some parks or build a more healthy hospital. They're doing one in Liverpool as well. It's a great idea. The evidence is there, but the NHS is still looking at the bottom line figures, and it's going to cost more. So we need to think more innovatively, really, about what we're doing. And all these things have an impact on what we can and can't do. And when I worked for East Cambridgeshire District Council, my nickname was No But. Like, my boss said, can we do this? No, but we can do this. So I'd looked at the problem and gone, we can't solve that immediately, but we can do something similar and probably cheaper. So again, there's lots of different ideas here, and they're the things that come up constantly in these debates. And again, there is no one solution. So we have to define the spatial context. So 3 examples here. The Cambridge, the regional sort of GI strategy looked at linking things across the whole of the region, so in all the districts. And it sat well with the regional strategists, thinking, actually, yeah, if we can get this across Cambridgeshire, into Fenland, into Suffolk, there's an added value there. So they started to think a little bit more about the connective nature of green infrastructure and what benefit that might have. And especially when you link it into the A14 extensions and the new building around Cambridge itself, these sort of ideas of locating development within a green environment sat very well with sub-regional members. Not all the time, but there were some positives. The JFK Boulevard in Boston used to be a big highway, and it was awful. It was polluted, it was dangerous, it cut off the part of the riverfront from the city, and it was sort of slightly absent from the spatial footprint of the area. And they created this greenway, which is wonderful. It's green, it's healthy, it's got biodiversity there, it helps the climate change mitigation of the city. It also moves people away from certain areas into new parts of the city. So there's economic growth potential there. Now, none of this is new. We've had it for 150 years with Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities. Those things keep coming back at time and time again. So it's almost as if we know the information, and we have data, and we have the evidence, and we have the drive. We're just too scared to really push it. And I think now, conferences like this, with people who are actually engaging directly with government, is one way of actually making a slight difference here, and actually making things more visible. So one thing that I think we haven't done is we haven't framed GI as an essential infrastructure. Now, this came out in some work I've been doing recently in India, where students said to me, if I haven't got a house, or water, or power, or a toilet, why do I need some grass? And my response was, I don't know then. But if you take a slightly different view, is that there's water shortage issues. You work better with sustainable drainage. You start to manage the system more effectively. In the city of Ahmedabad in Gujarat, they have really bad monsoonal rains. And they've put all their pipes underground, and they basically flood every year for about 2 months. If they were thinking more innovatively about using SUDs, that might be a way of slightly mitigating the extreme nature of the flooding events. Not just taking it wholesale and transplanting it to India, but modifying it for the climate and for the needs of the local people. So we have to think about how we engage with the sort of traditional infrastructure people, water, sewage, power, and how we actually get this onto a level playing field. And if I knew how to do this, I would probably be a very rich man. Unfortunately, it is this constant process of discussion and negotiation and banging on the door and trying to explain to them why it's important. And we are starting to see some shifts. TfL has started to look more at the greening of their buildings, to look at climate change and use less electricity. So there is incremental growth in these ideas, but it is still quite difficult. And because of that, there is still a lack of commonality, really, between what something is worth. If we try and say how much is a tree worth, is it worth the £100 it cost to buy it? Is it worth the £1,000 it puts onto a house price? Or is it worth £1 million for the climate control of the city? All these figures, plucked out of the air, might be correct. But because they are so varied, it can be quite difficult to report these to the people who write the checks or say yes to things. But there has been this movement in the last 15, 20 years, and this is where my economics background just shows up that I haven't got one, is that numbers scare me along with water, that when we start to look at how much something's worth, be it through hedonic pricing or willingness to pay or input-output local area multipliers, the data is normally insufficient, so the outputs are insufficient for what we actually need. And I think one thing that we've been guilty of is we're trying to engage with people who have very strict rules and regulations and procedures about creating a number and a value, and we can't necessarily engage on the same level, because the way we do this, we're still slightly scared about working with the figures. But it is getting better, and it is becoming more common to see valuations put on things. And one thing, the last point here I think is really important, is that the majority of the world's most livable and prosperous cities have major green infrastructure sites. The City of London is about 38–39% green. London is fantastic. New York has Central Park, but it also has a lot of investment going on in Brooklyn and in Queens and along the seafront. They're places people want to go. They're places people want to invest in. So there is a financial value there. We've just been worse at saying what they are. Other cities, Mumbai for instance, they're destroying their green space to meet the needs of accommodation. And I think the last time I looked, that Mumbai might be the most expensive per square metre real estate land in the world. And the pace of growth is outweighing any sort of chance to retain green infrastructure. So whilst we can cite it as saying this is essential, in terms of meeting certain needs, be it housing, it can be quite difficult. And that's where we can't just translate the things that we do in the UK or the US or Europe to India or China. We had a question earlier on about China, and China can do things because their government can make it happen. The UK, it takes a lot longer. So we have to engage with these ideas. We can't just try and go around the back. So here's the maths. And I think the question we all need to try and understand is, do we need to break it down into a simple equation? And this was done in a pub, by the way, so the economists, please don't try and work out how it works. And basically it says, would you be willing to pay more to live in a green place that was a green location near your house that made you feel better and actually improve the quality of your life, against the fact that you might already pay a large mortgage and that the built infrastructure might not be that great? So it's, do you like a green environment? Would you pay more for it? And this came out of work done by the University of Sheffield, which I was lucky enough to be involved with, where they tried to value the economic returns you could get from placing street trees in central Manchester. Now, any of you who know Whitworth Road in Manchester, near Oxford Road Station, Hacienda at one end of it, there was no greenery on that street for many, many years. And because of this, it was quite bleak, and people sort of walked through very quickly, because there was no reason to stop. Now, the Mersey Forest and the Red Rose Forest, through Interreg funding at the European scale, have planted in a number of trees there, and you're always trying to see people slow down slightly. This is quite anecdotal, but people walk through there now as if they're not in a rush. They go to the shops more. There's a few more bars down there. It's created a nicer environment for investment. And the output of this work basically said that people would pay more council tax to live in a greener area on that street. Now, when you take that to Manchester Council, they go, oh, that's great, that's wonderful. But when you say it could give you £150,000 more council tax per year for this ward, they start to listen. And that's where the numbers can become really, really powerful, and that's why they have to be correct. So again, this equation didn't go into that report, but it's just one of those things which we use to try and think about it. But trying to balance these tangible and intangibles is really quite difficult. And yesterday, I was at the same talk at the Olympic Park, and one of the guys said, well, sometimes we just have to say something's nice. It's nice to be outside. We don't have to say it's worth £1 million. It's just nice to go for a walk. And yes, I think we may all agree with this, but when it comes to getting things done, we still have to try and come up with the figures. So balancing the tangibles and the intangibles can be quite difficult. And that makes it more difficult when we have to work out what we're trying to actually invest in. So is it parks and gardens? Is it green walls and green roofs? Greenways, floodplain mitigation, woodlands and forests, or business parks and gated communities? All of these things here use green infrastructure to actually improve what they do, and they're all green infrastructure elements. And the discussion this morning about water, I think, is often overlooked in a green infrastructure debate, except in the US, where they're so water-centric, they actually miss out the green things as well. So we have to try and balance this. But because of this, we are trying to balance socioeconomic things versus environmental benefits, which can be quite difficult, especially given the range of things we're trying to invest in. So there's 4 quick examples. The Seattle Central Library, top left, the High Line, top right, Russell Square, bottom left, and Wicken Village Green / Village Park in Wicken in East Cambridgeshire, all of which are using green infrastructure elements, all of which are using them in a different way, and all of which are trying to do different things. So the Seattle Library, they're trying to raise awareness of the environment by bringing nature indoors, by trying to actually say to people, if you're in a building, you don't have to be away from nature. Actually, you can still engage with it, which is quite a nice idea, given that the building is quite open and airy anyway. They've actually made it almost like an inside jungle in certain areas. The High Line we all know about, massive tourist attraction, the second most visited place in New York now. Real estate's gone up by 100% around there. Economically, it makes a lot of sense. Russell Square, one of the historic parks of London, always full of people. Even when it's raining, it's full of people. They go there to drink their coffee, to walk the dog, to play frisbee, to study, if they're from UCL or SOAS. If you try to take that away from them, I think there'd be uproar. And then the more rural one, which is a small woodland on a village green. Compared to the others, it's probably a lot smaller and maybe not as interesting. But for that small community, having their own woodland, which they help to plant, which they help to fund, you actually start to get something which has ownership. And I think all of these things have an ownership angle here, which we can work from. So we have to understand what we're trying to do and where. And when it comes to funding these things, there are lots of different ways of doing it, and none of them are perfect. And one of the things that I think is really important is to say that if you're developing an investment of the size of the Olympic Park, or even something smaller, say a small community park, the costs cannot be gained from one source alone. You have to look at a number of different avenues for funding, otherwise you won't get anything. And you start to play them off against each other, saying if we get heritage lottery funding, then we can have housing growth funding, as was. We can get some more Section 106 agreements. So you have to be very strategic in a way about how you bring these things together. And there's been a lot of reporting and research recently about how each of these things could work. I particularly like the referendum in Paris of 2 or 3 weeks ago, where the city government said, we've got €20 million to spend, here's a list of projects you can pick from and we'll do the most popular. And I think they picked green roofs and green walls. So the messages are getting across. It's just how we have to go through with this. The one thing I would have a reservation about would be the SIL. Having worked on SIL schedules, I think the way that they're framed and what investment is deemed to be more important than others sometimes limits the environmental angle of it. That's particularly the case in certain places in Cambridgeshire. And also the one from Policy Exchange, who I'm quite happy they aren't here to tell me off, to actually ask people to pay more council tax if they live near a park. Now, they've already paid more for their house or their rent. They probably already pay more council tax anyway. I don't think you could then start to ask them to pay more again. But maybe it's one way. So there are lots of different avenues that we can follow for finding funding. So it's not completely pessimistic. But to attain funding from any of these areas, you have to be quite specialist. You have to have a knowledge and an expertise of what they actually will fund and how to do it. And you've got to enjoy writing funding bids, which I'm not sure many people in this room actually enjoy, because I personally hate them. And so it becomes almost a carousel, a process of applying for funding and maybe not actually getting things done because you're trying to find the money. But options are available. We just have to try and work out which ones are the most appropriate. Now, to give a few examples, just quickly, Gervais Park in Liverpool, part of the Liverpool 1 development. There are people from Liverpool in the room who will probably tell me I'm wrong in a second. But it was part funded by the Grosvenor Development Group, who developed Liverpool 1 itself. And it's now part funded in terms of the management by the car park, which is underneath it. So it's managed by a private company. It's a public open space. It's always open. There's no gates on it. It's well used throughout the week and in the evenings. There are bars and restaurants there. And it's funded by a slightly different mechanism. The local planning authority doesn't have to put any money into this. So they like that. They like the idea that they'll have this landmark park in the city centre, but they don't have to pay for it. Secondly, Wicken Fen Natural Nature Reserve. In Cambridgeshire, a 100-year strategy to improve this area of Cambridgeshire. Most people like it, except one gentleman who's a farmer in South Cambridgeshire. And they've applied for funding from all these different areas here. And because of the strategic nature of what they're doing, and one of the things that came out of it earlier on is that we're not just talking about 5-year political cycles, we're talking about much longer periods, is that they've managed to say, well, we can do this incrementally. It's not just about doing it all in the first 5 years. It's like we can do a little bit, then a little bit more, and a little bit more. And they've actually been far more successful that way because they've been able to do a project, report on it, and then get more funding based on what they were actually talking about previously. So it's almost that they've thought long-term and strategically because that's the only way this could work. But it does show that with the right people involved and with that sort of incremental approach, it can be quite informative and quite successful. And finally, one from London, the Bankside Urban Forests. Again, a range of different funders. So Section 106, strategic funding from the boroughs, crowdsourcing and funding. We are seeing more options become available for what funding is there, particularly things like crowdsourcing for smaller projects. So which I think is a new way, a novel way of really getting the message across. In the same way that Twitter makes everything available instantaneously, crowdsourcing takes away some of that political nature of trying to go through the Heritage Lottery Fund, because it becomes more instantaneous. So again, there was talk earlier on about reporting things quite quickly, but still engaging with the wider processes. I think this has been one of the areas which has been quite successful here. And they've used their meanwhile spaces really well. And given that South London doesn't have many meanwhile spaces anymore, getting in there and using them for a year or 2 years has a really big impact, especially where the orchard was on Union Street. Compared to where the fire station is next to it and the Sainsbury's at the top of the road, it makes a dramatic visual impact on that street. And people saw it and then knew what this was about. So each of those 3 projects looked at things in a different way. And they've all been relatively successful, but they're all still ongoing. So I think finally, to come to a few, maybe not quite so pessimistic as I probably set out to be, conclusions, that there is a fluidity to how we look at financing and valuing green infrastructure and environmental resources. So one model does not and cannot fit all. We've got people here, next speaker is from Nantes. They've got a different model to what they have in London, and that's really important. All these ideas means that we can just steal them and use them for our own and make best use of them. But also, because we're working with the landscape, and the landscape is invariably a big thing, but also a very small thing, we have to think about the broader impacts and the broader connections, but then we can start to filter it down to the local. The Bankside project is in one borough of London, but it's part of the London GI plan, I assume. It's part of the wider GI network. So we can start to go upwards and downwards. And there is a growing understanding that we do need to value and have these conversations for green infrastructure. We do need to look at the economics of it and produce figures. They're not necessarily easy to do, but it gets you into the right conversations. It gets you to talk to the people who actually make the decisions. If you can go to a local planning authority and have a win-win for a project that is cost neutral or cost negative, but will give them more back in council tax returns or house prices, people like these ideas. So it's about framing what we say to them and getting the right data. And that will involve continuing work by advocacy groups. There are some here, but also the Community Forest, Natural England, some of the smaller community groups who have got all the knowledge, but they rarely get asked their opinion, or their opinion is often put to one side during larger consultations. These are people who can tell you the exact benefit they get from that local park. And that's really, really important because they're the people who will use it and look after it in the long term. And so the discussions are becoming slightly easier, but they're still embryonic in a sense, really. And so I think, to finish, I think we all understand that there's a value in nature. And we all know that we'd like to have more of it and keep it in a better state. But that doesn't really appeal to an economist or a politician or somebody who's an accountant. So we need to do these things, and there are lots of options for doing it. But if we have the right people in the right places, knowing the right information, it can work. And I think one thing to finish on is that green infrastructure thinking is constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. Where we were in 2000, 2005, when it was first becoming known, was the basic information. Where we are now is a lot more detailed, a lot more focused. But the ideas are still the same. And it will continue to grow and develop further as we go through the next 5, 10 years. And if we continue to have these conversations with economists and with politicians, then hopefully we should have to get them to understand that it's really important. We'll hear this afternoon from the Greater London Authority about the Mayor's GI plan. It looks actually quite good and quite interesting. Very different to where we were 10 years ago. So progress is happening. And we just need to keep banging on that door saying this is important. And hopefully, eventually, people will listen. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.